So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to everybody who's joined us today here in the room and also online. We really appreciate you making the time. So we'll be talking today about our RDA working group, which is broadening the umbrella of trust, building support for modular certification. And this is the Technical Repository Service Providers Working Group. So I'm Lauren Maxwell. I'm one of the co-chairs of this working group, joining from Universitätsklinikum Heidelberg, which is a university hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. And we will start off with an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present. So today we'll start out with a welcome and welcome and introduction, a brief case statement overview, and then I'll switch over to Wim, who's going to be talking about the summary of the work that we've done to date, and then also our outreach and alignment efforts, and then we'll talk about our third community consultation, and then our next steps. So just to start off the bat, for anyone here who's new to RDA, these are the guiding principles of RDA: openness, community-driven, consensus, nonprofit and technology neutral, harmonization, and inclusivity. And for our working group, so we began this working group at, I think it was P23, sounds right, 22, there we go, okay, in Austria with a Birds of a Feather session to talk about how could we do better in the repository landscape. So what came out of that Birds of a Feather where the objective is of this working group, which was to conduct a landscape review of existing certification schemes, to understand where those schemes align and where there are disconnects, and to extend trust frameworks beyond data sets, so to consider as well code and semantic artifacts, to establish, identify modular features and characteristics of repositories, where we could think about a modular certification approach as opposed to a binary 0-1 certification approach for repositories, to determine which repository functions could be delegated to service providers. So could we have certification for a function of a service provider so that repositories don't have to certify for that specific function? And then think about alternatives to formal or binary certification, including modular, metadata-driven assessments of repositories and services. So here's a link to our case statements. And then this working group really came out of this disconnect that we see in the repository landscape, which is that there are many, many repositories, and that landscape is growing quite rapidly because obviously the barriers to creating repositories are going down. And then we see that certification is just not keeping track. So the methods that we've developed over time to certify these repositories are not being implemented, and so we'd like to understand why and think about alternatives so we could identify trusted repositories. So here's a calculation that Wim had made early on to think about, why do we need this working group? And here you can see that we have many, many repositories, and then few of these repositories are being certified. And one of the issues, so there are many issues that we were thinking about when we were forming this working group, but we can see that formal certification is really, we can think about as a barrier. So the steps that repositories need to go through to achieve formal certification and then recertify are perceived as a bottleneck for many repositories, and so we can think about repository certification as being too costly or too complex. We can think about repositories not having sufficient capacity to get through the certification process. We can think about different ways of certification, so thinking about can we certify outputs, can we certify software, can we certify, are there other ways to think about building trust in repositories in terms of the feature, the performance of those repositories? And then can we think about how we can include service providers in the certification landscape? So there are many issues in this landscape that we are also not considering, including uncurated flows, the rate of curation, so how fast this is happening, and then also mechanisms for curation. And this was the work plan that we came up with. So these are our deliverables and how those deliverables intersect with the different RDA plenaries. So we are now at P25, and we have completed, so Vim will talk about where we are in kind of the achievement of our deliverables, but we've done a lot of work collectively with working group members to date that we'll discuss today, and we are close to the end of the life of this working group. So we're working on kind of finalizing our outputs and summarizing, thinking about how we can bring our recommendations to related work. And so Vim will come up and talk about the progress to date that we've made in our working group.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. So I think the slides, of course, will be shared so that you can access the links that we are presenting here. There may not be a simple way to do that at the present time, but I'll quickly take you through the content that we have worked through in the working group in the past 18 months or so, and where we stand with the synthesis work that has to happen towards an output from this working group. And I'll switch back to Lauren at the point where we ask your participation and inputs into a white paper that we are also working on. Sometime during the course of this review of progress, we're going to ask for your inputs via a Mentimeter poll, which I think has achieved the status of pie charts 30 years ago. Every presentation must have one, so we have a Menti presentation, but it's particularly useful, I guess, for this hybrid situation where we also have participants online. Okay, so the pictures may be a little dense to take in one go. But effectively, what this shows is an overview of the landscape analysis that we performed largely during the first 6 to 8 months of the life cycle of our working group. And what we did there was to work through a large number of sources to identify the repository attributes that they either work with directly or imply by way of, for argument's sake, criteria for certification in Core Seal or elsewhere. So we work through the trust principles, Core Seal, the POSI, the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure, which, by the way, if you haven't looked at it yet or are not aware of it, is quite interesting to have a look at, because it's heavily focused on sustainability and openness, which I think is often sort of forgotten in the frenzy to do everything related to FAIR. And it makes us forget the other important things that we also have to take care of. So POSI focuses a lot on sustainability and on the idea that any public open infrastructure should be reproducible by way of open code and open data, should it not be in a position to continue. So those kinds of ideas are presented in POSI. We've looked at some interesting inputs from the EOSC PID policy that are pertinent to repositories, outputs from an earlier working group here in RDA called the Digital Repository Attributes Working Group, or DROG as we often refer to it. We also looked at the CTM, capability models, CARE principles, the Global Open Research Commons, which is also an RDA output, and so on. So there's a large number of these inputs that we considered during our landscape analysis phase. And while it is somewhat subjective, we created what might be very useful in other contexts, and that's a set of mappings between them. So that if Core Seal, for instance, and the trust principles or the CARE principles identify more or less the same kind of action or behavior or performance requirement for a repository, then we map these together so that we can gain some sense of what the landscape expects us to know about a repository. And the main intent of this was to come up with a consolidated model of which we only see the top level here, roughly categorized by way of the trust principles at a high level. In other words, let's say container concepts such as sustainability, responsibility, transparency, user focus, and technology. But many of the additional attributes that we have already identified relate to cost and cost recovery mechanisms, business models, and the like. So we've added a new category in addition to the trust ones at a high level that addresses these cost-related aspects. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a snapshot of what we call the landscape analysis table, which really is a summary of all these attributes that we gather from the different input sources and the mappings between them. And this is, at the current time, still work in progress because we are in the middle, more or less, of linking the TRSP working group's initial set of attributes to the ones identified in Europe by the EOSC EDEN project. They are looking at repository attributes from the perspective of long-term preservation as a sort of main perspective, but of course they also identify repository attributes adjacent to this and more or less in the broad scope of curation and preservation in digital repositories. So this will finish hopefully quite soon, probably in a matter of weeks, if not days. And then we will have completed, to my mind, this analysis work around the attributes that we could gather from landscape assessment. The main reason we do this is quite long-winded approach to identifying everything that we can find, but we want to narrow it down towards basically two things. The one is which of these attributes are applicable in the context of technical service providers to repositories and archives. I would think that there could be possibly two examples of this that sort of illustrate the kind of facilities that we're talking about. So one might be a long-term preservation service. So there could be archives or repositories that don't necessarily have their own long-term preservation service, but they contract a third party to provide those services for them. And there are several of these service providers in existence, so it's quite a pertinent use case. So that would be one example. The other one could be cross-cutting services that are offered to repositories, for argument's sake, for fair assessment. There seems to me to be little incentive for repositories to perform fair assessment on their own with infrastructure that they build and maintain themselves. It's a sort of a prime candidate for a shared service that multiple repositories can employ. But of course, they provide services to repositories, so they are in scope for the type of attributes that we want to identify in respect of these service providers. And then we also have the concept of software platforms or offerings. So Invenio, on which the Nodo is based, or Dataverse could be examples of those. Probably Figshare for institutions is another one. So the question also arises which attributes are important from a community perspective to expose in respect of these software platforms, the things that they can and cannot do, and the things that they support or don't support. So these two, let's say, additional perspectives on repository attributes are where we are now, is to try and identify them. We have shared a list of higher level groups of attributes at previous plenaries. We've had community input and feedback about them, and I'll spend a bit of time just now on going through them and telling you more or less what we got from those initial community engagements. Okay, so first of all, we asked people to identify out of a list of maybe 50 attributes or so, the ones that they thought apply to service providers. So this would now typically be, for argument's sake, a fair evaluation service or a long-term preservation service or anything of that nature, something that can be assigned to a third party. And we got back quite a large number of attributes from our community engagement that were seen as being in scope for such service providers. The cutoff that I applied arbitrarily here was to say that 75 of respondents or more indicated that they thought that this was an important attribute for such service providers. So there are more, and one can cut deeper or shallower if you wish to do so. But I thought that that was a sort of a useful cutoff to say, you know, if 3/4 of the responses indicate that these are important, then we would include them in the list. This list is not moderated or, let's say, challenged in any way yet. So there will be attributes in there that probably do not make sense or can be combined with others, or which we can still form an opinion about and say maybe it's not so important even though it may be applicable, and so on. So we'll return to this to get your inputs on it. But the most important, let's say, salient point that I think we should recognize across these 2.5 pages or so of attributes that are applicable to services is that, yes, of course, the idea that this is a service and that it should be certified or somehow measured against service quality considerations comes through in our attributes. So things like FIT-SM or ISO 9000, ISO 27001, things that relate to process quality and service quality and availability and security came through quite strongly in attributes that we do not see for, let's say, something like Core Seal certification as explicitly. And this makes perfect sense, of course, because if you are engaging a service, you would like to know that this service's availability and quality assurance and security and integrity is taken care of properly. So those are the broad considerations that we identified in terms of these services, the attributes that apply to them. Then for software platforms, the idea of some kind of certification or information about information security also scored quite highly. Things like discovery, metrics, terms and conditions, licenses, the usual suspects are all there. But another one that is quite interesting, and this speaks to, let's say, an insight that we had earlier in the working group's lifetime, and that is that some of these attributes are normative. In other words, we're going to use them to decide whether the level of performance is adequate from a service or a repository or a software platform. But some of them are just informative. It's the basis of selection for us when we decide whether we are going to use such a service, but we don't expect it to form part of any kind of certification criteria. So a very good example of that is right at the bottom there, the deposit properties. Because often a depositor would select a repository on the basis that it can accept very large data files, which some other repositories may not be able to accept. So these sort of informative attributes become important when you are probably both a service provider and or a software platform provider, because end users will select on that basis even if it doesn't form part of certification. So again, for software platforms, there are these usual attributes that we can recognize from the sort of certification landscape, but then also performance in respect of service quality, and then these informative attributes also show up there. Okay, and then what became very interesting, and this of course is part of a very broad and important and somewhat contentious conversation, is to say, yes, but if I would develop a set of certification criteria for service providers and or software platforms, which of these can be inherited if I am, for argument's sake, going to certify a repository with Cortra seal, right? If any. Because at the current point in time, even if you are using a third-party supplier, for argument's sake, for long-term preservation, you have to go through the process of gaining certification for the attributes or characteristics associated with long-term preservation, let's say independently, if you apply, for argument's sake, for Cortra seal certification. So the question we asked of the participants in previous engagements is to say which of these attributes you think can possibly be inherited. So for argument's sake, if a software platform is certified in terms of information security, it may remove the need to recertify in terms of information security if you are using that platform, and so on. So in our previous feedback engagements, we got this list of attributes that could possibly be inherited. Now, as part of our working group work plan, we undertook, amongst others, to send a list of these attributes that were identified, together with the ones that were tagged as being inheritable in certification context, to Cortra seal to get their feedback and impressions and ideas about it, which we will do, of course. But we've also decided just recently that we might as well send it to a larger number of stakeholders, including other certification authorities, the Trust Working Group here in RDA, the World Data System, and so on. Let's say networks and initiatives that we are aware of, or authorities that we are aware of, that are sort of involved directly or indirectly in the field of certification of repositories. So that will happen in the next 6-month cycle of work, is to share this formally and to get some feedback in respect of what these formal structures think about the inputs that we are providing. Okay, so we'll return to this to get your formal inputs, to give you time to look at them and tell us whether you think some of them are completely out of line or whether there are ones that we are missing, obvious oversights. So we'll return to this shortly. But there are 3 things to highlight. The one is that there are, basically all of them have the same source, and that is that on the left-hand side, the items in the red cells, those are attributes that were identified as being inheritable, but nobody put them at a high level of importance for either services or software platforms, which means that people think they should be inherited if they are, for argument's sake, certified in terms of a software platform, but they didn't identify them as being one of the important attributes for a software platform. So we are proposing that we make some executive decisions, as it were, about these, which we'll also get your input for in a short while. And one of them is that the data is free attribute. We just say we are going to remove it as an inheritable attribute. So if data is free in a software platform, to my mind, that's meaningless from in respect of the repository that might be using that software platform. They can decide again that their data is not free, for instance. So I don't think it's something that makes sense. But the other two, long-term persistence at format and bit level preservation, I think we should add that to the services and software platform attributes. And similarly, the same for the fact that the software required to run the infrastructure is open source. Either that or it is placed in escrow, so that if a service or repository or service software platform ever stops operating, it's possible to get hold of the software that produces the service to the end user. I haven't seen any cases of software placed in escrow in the research field. I've seen it in commercial circumstances, but I suppose it is an option that if the software somehow imparts competitive advantage to your service, that you still undertake to make it available, but it's held by a third party until such time that people might need it. So I think that's also something that we can add to the services and software platform attributes. Okay, so we'll get back to the white paper to summarize the workgroup outputs. But now it's first of all, time for some community feedback from yourselves. So the feedback platform, as I said, will be a Mentimeter. I need to fire it up on this side so that you can start using it. And we have 5 participants already and growing rapidly. But while you are busy getting ready to answer the questions, I'm just going to provide some additional context. And sorry, I had to modify these slides on the fly here at this before the start of the session, because there's supposed to be shading there that wasn't visible on the projector. But in effect, we have made a sort of a survey of a very large number of possible attributes for services and software. And from that, we have now selected, as you've seen, the subset of attributes that apply to technical repository service providers, or TRSPs, as we call them. So that's the first kind of determination or classification or tagging that we do, is we tag these attributes effectively and say they apply to software platforms, to service providers, or to both of them. But and these all possible attributes that we're looking at comes from a wide variety of sources, as we've indicated. So we can also go and tag attributes with their origins or their sources, and as a result, we have, in effect, a sort of a cross-mapping between DROG and GAWK, for instance, because we can identify common attributes, or we can map fair sharing identified attributes to Court-Rasil identified attributes, because we tag the attributes with their sources. So that's one possible view on it that comes directly from the work here in the TRSP working group. But we can now go and narrow it down and say the services and software has been doubly checked by the community through feedback sessions and engagements, and we've sent them to Court-Rasil, to World Data System, to Nestor, to others, and we've gotten their feedback as well. So our recommendations that we publish at the end of the life of the working group is quite a solid set of services and software attributes for certification of some kind, or at least validation of some kind, that we can go and tag as well. So what I'm moving towards is to say that in the EOSC EDEN project, we have this concept of a whole bin of attributes that we can tag with profiles. In other words, we can make a profile for services, or we can make a profile for software platforms, or for the GORC, or for Core Trust Seal, and extract the set of attributes that apply to that profile. So individual repositories can also have a profile, because you can go and tag all of the attributes that your repository is able to provide to the outside world, whether it's for certification or for informative purposes or whatever reason. And of course, if you want to be certified by Core Trust Seal, you must make sure that at least those attributes that Core Trust Seal expect to be there are available. So this might in future become quite handy as a tool for saying, I wish to be able to provide Core Trust Seal with the information they need, but I also want to be able to fill in all of the attributes required by re-free data and so on. What is the composite set of attributes that my repository has to maintain to be able to tick all these boxes? So because we have these mappings and taggings available, it's possible, at least in theory, to provide a resource where, depending on what your repository or service wants to achieve, you can go and identify the minimum set of attributes that you need to expose and maintain, and make sure that you have, in many cases, evidence to support a claim for those attributes. So that's the idea that we're working towards. And in EDEN and in the FIDELIS project, we will set up a registry of repositories for the purposes of those projects. And they are European focused, but of course all of this work is open, so it can be reused and repurposed in other parts of the world as and when required. And there, effectively, the ideas of saying we can profile a repository, but we can also profile the purposes to which sets of attributes and evidence can be applied. And then it's possible to figure out that you have all of the requisite attributes available. Okay, we have 28 participants in our online survey. So let's get going. The first question is more about your stakeholder group, and you can answer more than one if need be. And in the meantime, I'll try to get us to a point where we can see online responses. It looks as if I'm going to have to only refresh this once everybody has answered, because it doesn't update dynamically, because the presenter cannot be on the presentation laptop. Okay, we've got 16 of 28 participants. I can refresh from time to time, I think. Give a little bit of time still. Okay, and it's very encouraging that we have a good sample of repository service providers in the room. So I'm going to give it another half a minute or so. Okay, so largely repository managers, service providers, and data stewards and data managers, some researchers. So a good spread of actors in the ecosystem that we have today. Okay, the next question relates to where you are from. You can click anywhere in the map. Yes, that's true. I spent about 10 minutes trying to persuade Menti to make it bigger, but but I was not successful. But I thought it was a nice map. Okay, we're about 3/4 with our responses. So we've got a good smattering of Australasia and Oceania this time round. In previous, it's been missing in our previous work group engagements that I think were all in Europe and in Costa Rica. So we had a very narrow representation there. Yes. Yeah. There we go. Updated again. That's 25 out of 30. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot the instructions from our very helpful support staff. I have to duplicate my screen. There we go. Yeah. Okay, so we're almost fully done with answers in terms of where people are from. Okay, so time to move on. Yeah, nice spread. Okay, so if you recall these decisions that we need to make about orphan inheritance attributes, if you could call them that, the fact that data is free, I think should possibly be removed, and that these others two, the other two, management of persistence and open sourcing software, that we add those to the attributes. We're asking your opinion on whether we can go ahead with these ideas. And the fact that data is free looks as if it has at least a dual distribution. So that makes it difficult because we can't please everybody. So that's the state of play, with about half the results in. Maybe we'll get a spurt from the swing states just now. Okay, so even though all of the results are not in yet, I think the only one that appears to be a bit of a discussion point is this this concept of data is free. So I don't know if anyone in the audience or online has a strong opinion about the fact that we should maybe still include it as an attribute that can be inherited. So remember, this is not about the fact that it's maybe an important attribute for a service or a software platform, but whether that attribute can be inherited if the platform would be certified, for instance. For me, that seems not so easy to transfer to whoever is going to use that platform. But if there are strong opinions that you want to express directly, that's fine. There's also a question or an opinion in the chat. Well, or if you have opinions online, please type them into the platform, or even in the collaborative notes. Yeah. Okay, so maybe let's deal with that question while we're waiting. No, none. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. Okay, but so what are we going to do with number 1? Err on the side of caution and include it for now. And then we might get this final round of feedback from the certification authorities and the networks and so on. And then we base our decision on what they tell us, I think. That'd be okay? Because, yeah, it seems ambivalent at the moment. 3.2 is just over halfway, so yes.
I actually misread the question, so instead of using the scale as agree and disagree, I treated it as add or remove. So
Oh.
strongly disagree, meaning agree.
Yeah.
Remove
I think it's almost the same outcome, though, isn't it? It's, yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's true. So maybe the axis should be reworded in a way. Yeah. Okay, but let's keep that in the air then. There's not a conclusive answer yet, and see what kind of feedback we get from our formal requests for such feedback, and then take it from there. Okay, then this is quite difficult, I would think, because we need to show you these attributes that are currently identified for the different services. So I'm going to flip between these screens slowly so that you have time to see the attributes that have already been identified in respect of service providers in this case. In other words, if you imagine someone like a fair evaluation service or a long-term preservation service, maybe look through these. And if you think one or two attributes may be missing, that we are... Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Thanks for that. Okay, it's a bit more legible now. So I'm going to leave it on the screen, slowly flip through it. So if you look at this and think about the service provider types of situations, and if you consider or think about an attribute that we may have missed, that would be very useful if you could add it into the Menti. So as I say, I'm going to flip after a minute or so, and then you'll have to maybe keep mental track of what you've seen. Okay, next one. Okay, and we're getting some nice feedback already. There's 3 additional attributes that people consider to be important. And the last one. And it's okay if you rather add something, even though it might be in the list and you've missed it, because of course we can sort that out. So. Okay, and I'm going back to the first one again. Sounds a little bit like an eye test. Okay, and the second one. And the last one again. Anyone need to have a look at previous slides? Okay, number 2. And number 1 for the last call. Okay, so all good? Ready for viewing results? Okay, so we got quite a few additions there. PID, ethics, T's and sorry, I keep on forgetting this very critical step. Okay. So there's ideas around PID integrations, ethics. Yeah, the fact that reliability is hard to measure and quantify. Terms and conditions, which I think are in there already in one way or another. Attribution of credit. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe certification according to different levels of performance, I think is what is meant there. Transparent business models. Yeah. The metadata license, I think, is an interesting one because it doesn't come up a lot. But of course, at least in Europe, bibliographic data is technically subject to GDPR. And you have to explicitly get to some kind of declaration that it's not so from the provider, in my view. So that's, I think, is important. Okay, cool. So that is very useful for us. So we'll collate that with the current set before we send it out to Court Rasil and the like to get their feedback and inputs. Okay, then the next question deals with attributes to be added for software platforms. So let me maybe just go back to that view again. Okay, this time I got it right. So for software platforms, it's just that one screen, so that's a bit simpler. Those are the explicit attributes that were identified applicable to software platforms that people think should be available to the community. So if you have any strong opinions about ones that we should be adding, then please add them to the free text slide in Menti. See the PETs, just to clarify what that might be. Okay, cool. Anyone need more time to have a look at this? Leave it for another half a minute or so. Okay, and then if we look at the results so far for this, there are some confirmations, I would imagine, and then some additional considerations, some of which on the face of it we can just add to existing sort of groupings of attributes. For instance, the checksum generation, sort of this idea that you should easily get hold of some file-related metadata inside a data set, the sizes, the checksums, the extensions or the types and so on. So that's good. Okay, thanks very much. Leaving a last 10 seconds or so for a final contribution, but about half the respondents have added something, which I think is quite reasonable. Okay, and then we move on to the next part of our survey, which is new work, and that relates to your thoughts and inputs on how one could potentially, as the topic of our talk says today, extend the umbrella of trust. Because formal certification has its uses and it is an established fact in the landscape. But as Lauren pointed out in one of the introductory slides, a very small percentage of the repositories that we work with are actually certified. And that's unlikely to change in a hurry. So we're thinking of ways to fill that gap by at least making more information available, for argument's sake, with some form of self-certification or other forms of validation of the evidence that are presented. So with that in mind, we've constructed a few questions. And effectively, we're asking you to vote on these ideas. So the first one has to do with the type of attribute sharing. The options there is that there are now specifications available called FairyCat, amongst others, that allows you to directly share repository attributes in a machine actionable way, and it's very simple to implement. So that's one option. The other one is to share these attributes via a registry, such as refree data or fair sharing or others. I think Koara also now has a registry type arrangement. Or share directly to the certifier. Or any other method, and there will be an opportunity for you to suggest that method if you think any others are applicable. Just to point out, I don't want to put my finger on the scale, but if you share to the certifier, it's not necessarily so easy to obtain those attributes again for a different context. So the share to registry, share directly options are a bit more flexible and open in terms of reusability of the attributes. These attributes are potentially publicly available from the certifying authorities, but not always so interoperable. So that's an added consideration for us. Okay, and I'm looking at our polling numbers. So I think if we're at over 2/3, we can call the election and go on to the next one. We'll give it another half minute or so. Yeah, sure. Sorry, at my age, I am now decidedly unable to multitask, so need a reminder. Okay, so I think we've got a sizable response already, so I'm going to move on to the next question. And that relates to whether, if you've answered other and you feel strongly that there's another method to to let us know about it. So let's give maybe 30 seconds for that if somebody wishes to add something. Okay, you can always write to us if you, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Posting stuff to GitHub. It works, many people know how to use it, but I wouldn't say that it's a strong alternative. Yeah. But it's good to, sorry. Yeah. Yes. The one that says share computation instead, I'm not too sure what's meant there. So if it was posted online, maybe just elaborate a little bit more in the shared notes so that we...
So instead of sharing the data directly, some data owners or data silos can actually just vet the computation that goes into it. Oh. Hello? Yeah. All right. So instead of sharing the data, the computation goes to the data, and then the data owners can vet the computations instead. Okay.
Yeah, I think, but in this context, that's equivalent to exposing the attributes directly at the repository. So you basically can send whatever needs to work with those attributes to the repository and say, go and fetch it there. The computation may not happen there, but at least the information is available directly from source. Okay? All right. Next question. Which methods of assessment or evaluation do you think will be useful? So there's this concept of self-evaluation, where basically you just publish stuff and say, yeah, we implement the following metadata schema, we have a policy in respect of data security, blah, blah, blah. Here's all the stuff that we wish you to know about, and we may or may not provide evidence, but it's up to you to decide whether you accept our claims or not. Or there's some form of public assessment, some form of review or verification. And we'll get to the nature of that review or verification in a next slide. So at the moment, it means that the difference between the three is there's no verification. We just say it's true and you have to accept that. Or it can be verified publicly. We publish the evidence and anybody can give feedback and say, almost like Google reviews for a restaurant. Say, no, we don't think you're as good as you say you are. And the last one is TripAdvisor telling you it is actually a nice restaurant. Okay, so that's sort of the difference between these three, without necessarily worrying about how TripAdvisor comes to their conclusion. Right? So that's the three choices that we have here. And let me update. Okay, so there's a strong bias towards still having some kind of verification or review, I would conclude. And self-evaluation is the, let's say, the hindmost at the moment. And that seems to coincide with what we would expect anyway, intuitively. Okay, and if you had some strong opinions about a different approach, you can elaborate them for us. So let's give half a minute or so for any other alternatives that you might think about. So here we're not talking about the method of verification. We're talking sort of about the class of verification. Is it a completely self-made claim? Is it something where the public can provide some feedback, or is it something that's been formalized in one way or another, or provided by some kind of an authority? Okay, another 20 seconds and then we have to carry on. AI certification. Yeah, that sounds interesting. You know AI is the new blockchain, eh? It's useful for everything. Yeah. Thank you. So we've got three new ideas there that we'll have a look at. And I sort of agree that it's maybe a mixture of all. To say you can move from self-assessment to some kind of public verification or formal verification. That also makes sense because you have to start somewhere. Okay, and then which method is useful for such verification? Wrong slide. So here we're saying, you could provide just publicly available evidence. You could have peer review, which is more or less what Court Rasil does. A panel of experts or two reviewers in their case has a look at your publicly available evidence and decides whether it holds water or not. It can be audited like ISO, very formal process with auditors that meet certain minimum requirements performing such an audit. It could be agreed on public benchmarks. In other words, if you provide evidence, there could be some widely publicized way of determining whether that level of performance is adequate or not, or any other, for which we have only a few hats in the ring at the moment. So let me update this. Yeah. Okay, and we have almost 2/3 of respondents in already. So this is very good. Okay, another 10 seconds or so. And then again, if you had some other ideas about this, then please add them here so that we can have a look at it. And that's the last of our Mentimeter torture session. So thanks everyone for your attention and your very good level of response. Okay, so we'll give this another 10 seconds or so, and then Lauren will conclude our session. I'm just going to take it back to the white paper page. Okay, thanks. So let's switch back to the presentation. Okay, so you'll just have to skip through a few slides after that one. All right, thank you.
Fair enough. Thanks everyone for participating in that. It's great to have your feedback. So one of the pieces of work that we're doing now is a white paper to summarize the mapping exercise that Wim briefly talked about. So how do the different criteria across these certification schema overlap? Where are the gaps? And then also summarizing the feedback from these different community consultations that we've had at the different RDAs over the years that we've had this working group, And then thinking about how can we, what evidence do we have to support alternatives to the certification process that we have now? So what could be considerations for modular certification? So we'd be very happy to have folks' feedback on the white paper and their inputs. So this is the link to the white paper, which is very much a working draft, and that we'll be working to finalize over the next couple of months. And we will be, again, trying to kind of collate the findings from the different Mentimeters, but also from the landscape analysis. So there's quite a lot of work from the community on landscape analysis. And so now we have the job of trying to summarize that and figure out the main points. So I can, let's see. So a couple of things that we wanted to touch on in this white paper are, again, why we had this working group in the first place, how this work relates to related projects, so how we would like this work to be used by groups like FIDELIS or EDEN that Vim mentioned, also the Trusted Repository Metrics group, and then also do we see any kind of regional or over time differences in how repository certification is recommended to take place? And then what we know about barriers to repository certification as it is now, so in terms of the cost or the timelines or the frequency or the prevalence of certification, and then also what we see as next steps from the community feedback sessions that we've had. And a couple of limitations that we'd like to pull out here, and we'll also pull out in the white paper, are that this has been very North America, Europe focused, and we'd like to make this a larger conversation, so we'd be very happy to take your feedback there. And then thinking about, how we move this forward into next steps is another place that we'd love to get your feedback. And then we've talked today about, do we have attributes that we're missing? So we've come up with a couple of those, and we'll have to go back and just collate and see what we can bin and what we'll have to pull out as new attributes. And then we need to think more about how this could work in practice. So as I mentioned, EDEN and FIDELIS are actively working, so these are EU-funded projects that are actively working in the space. And then what are the different ways that the certification can take place? So we've seen that folks feel pretty strongly that there should be more than just self-certification. So we should have some kind of checks and balances on the certification process. So we've already gone through this. Yeah, okay, I'm just gonna be skipping a bunch of slides now. So one thing that we would like to pull out is this connection to EDEN and FIDELIS, and also to Core Trust Seal, which folks are likely familiar with, which is a long-standing independent data repository certification schema that Vim mentioned as well. And then, again, we want to think about how can we better engage with other geographies. So we have some engagement from B3 Data, and also one of our co-chairs who's not with us today, Allyson, is from fairsharing.org. So we'd like to also think about engaging groups through their networks, and then how to work more closely with Core Trust Seal. So Vim had talked to, I'm not sure who from Core Trust Seal, maybe Dawe, about having a joint session at the next P26, so coming together across our really closely related working groups. And then we've also thought about other alternatives for engaging repositories in the repository certification community, including social media engagements through LinkedIn or through banners on fairsharing.org. So they are going to be working on that. And then in terms of our priorities until the end of the working group, we will be thinking about, again, coming together to collate and synthesize our recommendations, think about next steps, and then also how to better engage with existing certification schema to think about putting these recommendations into practice. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to take the community feedback, bring this to the certification bodies and get their feedback, and then use that as part of the formal recommendation. So hearing from the community, hearing from the existing certification schema, and then putting that together in the white paper and submitting it to RDA as a community product. Let's see. So we'll also make available the inventory of attributes and mappings that we've made. So this is something that we'll publish to Zenodo and make available to the community. And then we would like to think more about what, other than the core trust seal, if I remember correctly, interest group or working group within RDA, what other groups we should be engaging to think about feedback on our recommendations. And this working group is still very much in progress. We'd be very happy to have the participation of anyone who is interested in joining our work to be part of summarizing the findings and thinking about next steps. We'd very much be welcome new members to our regular Wednesday meetings, which I don't think are at a time that is well suited for folks in Australia, if I'm remembering correctly, but we're also open to having a rotating time if that would be of interest to folks. So thank you so much for coming, and I'll open the floor to questions and comments. Anybody? Go ahead.
Sorry, one question. What's the timeline you guys are targeting?
Yeah, so our working group has been going for about 14 months, I would think. So I think if we stick more, less. Less, oh, okay. We still have a bit of time. But I have in my head that we should finish towards the next plenary or just after. So we're in the last third of work, I would say, in our work plan and time-wise. So another 6 months to maybe 8 months to go. The question at the back there.
That there are people online, then they won't be able to hear.
I'm just wondering how the certification process for repositories, whether that's mirrored in data spaces or how they connect, and whether that's been considered within this working group.
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent and important question. To be honest, we haven't surveyed that widely. And maybe we should in the remaining time, because especially in Europe, of course, this is an important emerging consideration. What I do know is that there are some domains that don't necessarily support the concept of certification of repositories. So there's also that, let's say, divergence of opinion to contend with. But maybe modular certification, something that says it's more community-driven, or there is at least such an alternative, is a bit more flexible and could find wider adoption. So I think that's a very good point for us to act on, especially in Europe. I don't know, in the US, there's also a data commons movement, certainly one in the health sciences. But I'm not aware of too many others, so it will be useful if you know of any that we should be looking at outside of Europe to let us know. Yeah.
So I'll just add a comment to that as well. So we did include GORC, so the Global Open Research Commons, as part of kind of the attributes that we were thinking about. And within GORC, we have, so I'm a co-chair of Health Data Commons Working Group within GORC. So I think when we think about like health data spaces, data spaces, data commons, for me there's not like a really clear kind of difference between those two groups. But I would say that I think your point is a great one, because we see, what we've seen in the repository landscape, we now see in the data commons and the data spaces landscape, which is basically an explosion of investments. And we need to think about more, what makes a trusted data commons or a trusted data space. So I will say that the GORC schema does consider that in some ways, but I think we could think about more closely engaging with that community, and we do have some engagements already with GORC, but I think we could do a better job.
Hi, I work with the Core Trust Seal community here in Australia, and I just note that the Core Trust Seal attributes are reviewed every 3 years, and they get revised according to community standards. So I don't know about the other standards. How do you take into account this kind of dynamic style of attributes?
Yeah,
or
so
potential dynamism?
Yeah, so we didn't spend much time on it at all, but we are developing more of a background conceptual model for contextualizing an attribute and its tags and the profiles that it fits into. And then, of course, versioning of those attributes become important because it's like a vocabulary, and you need to maintain backward compatibility with the sets of attributes and criteria they link to from past editions and versions of all these input sources. So behind the scenes, it's complex. We don't know, of course, in the RDA context, how the maintenance of the working group output will pan out. I mean, that's very flexible in RDA terms. But I think for FIDELIS, at least, that wants to establish at least an information source about a network of repositories in Europe. You know, they are one potential custodian of such a vocabulary of attributes.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the amazing job you did on the mapping. I opened the Excel file and it's incredible. And we are actually working on something similar in the context of the Czech Republic, because the Ministry of Education requires data and publications to be stored in trusted repositories. But what is that and how to measure that? So we are coming to this discussion and are thinking to implement some kind of measurements and these things to the national catalogue of repositories that we are building right now, which is kind of like the national RIT3 data. And we are building the infrastructure as well in the large project, so we can collect some data from the administrators and curators of the repositories. That's an advantage, but how to get that from the repositories that you are not in touch with the administrators is really challenging, and also how to evaluate that. So I was wondering if you know how you are going to evaluate some of the attributes, like if I put their license and I say I have license, so that's fine, or will be there difference if I say it's a Creative Commons CC0 or it's CC BY and these things, or there can be a huge difference in the documentation of the repository or the policy.
Yeah, so this is not, let's say, a simple answer, because different classes of attributes have different kinds of evidence. So many attributes can be substantiated by just pointing to some online document. In other words, we have a policy, or we have a workflow procedure, or we have a list of supported licenses, and so on and so on. Now, whether that policy contains the kind of content that you would wish it to contain, that is something that is the subject of a test, and whether it is good enough depends on the benchmark. So we are only going as far as potentially identifying the metrics to say this can be substantiated with a yes-no question and evidence, or this should be a list of stable URIs that identify the licenses or the metadata schema that you are supporting. But whether it's adequate for purpose, we cannot make that determination.
Thank you.
So I'll just add a comment to that. We did a project where we were looking at repositories for COVID-19 data. And our question was, how fair are these repositories? So how are they addressing the FAIR principles? And we started with just a kind of a small list. You know, do they have a clear license? Do they have a data governance framework? And we had some other questions. But I think there's so many questions you can ask of these repositories. And what's really important is, you know, what are the most important ones to you? Because getting the metadata to verify any of this will be quite challenging. And so I would recommend kind of coming up with a list and trying to pare it down. And then I think you could go for kind of somebody had suggested AI, AI-driven certification. I would recommend that. So I think we can have kind of human-in-the-loop AI, where we say, okay, this is what the AI model has told us. We can go to the repositories and say, is this correct? And perhaps they can surface metadata that would, contrast with the AI evaluation. So I think that's one way to do that. I can say there are many metrics, so kind of many existing ways to evaluate fairness. And when we applied those to the repository landscape, it didn't work well. And so I think, existing tooling to try to verify these just may not work well in practice, and so it would be important to kind of come up with a subset of the metadata that are really most important to your community around certification, and then probably come up with like a hybrid approach to trying to verify those is what I'd recommend.
Yeah, just a final thought on this. I mean, there was reasonable support for this idea of repository-based attribute provision. In other words, making sure that the source of truth for repository attributes comes directly from the repository instead of maybe fetching it from re-free data. So if you're interested in that, come and talk to me, because we have developed in the Fair Impact project some ideas around a new specification called FairyCat that is similar to signposting, if you're familiar with that, for metadata, but applies to the level of a repository or a service. And effectively, what it means is it's very simple to implement. And then if someone has a repository URL for the home page, they can find all the attributes directly in a machine actionable way. And read-free data and fair sharing, of course, fill very important roles in the landscape. But they are also battling at times to get repositories to maintain the synchronicity of what's actually happening. And so if one can get the repositories to provide this information at source almost, both for read-free data and fair sharing, to harvest from them, or from anybody else that wants that information to just go and fetch it there, that, at least to me, seems to be a simple solution to a common problem. Okay.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for your work on this. I'm coming at this as like a repository service provider perspective. And so I recall you mentioning having normative versus informative criteria for software platforms. And I was wondering if that would also be applied for service providers. In my context, which is Borealis, the national data repository in Canada, we have some features or functionality that is optional. So it will be implemented if it's requested by the institution. For example, some export workflows to support preservation. But in that context, then, would that, in terms of certification or the attributes, would that be considered we sort of fulfill that attribute, or it's informative in that we offer it, but it depends on implementation by the institutions themselves? Just wondering if there's any thought on that.
Yeah, it does apply across the board. So example that immediately comes to mind is, let's say, Core Trust Seal might ask the question as to whether you are community focused to the extent where you support the dissemination file formats that that community expects, right? But it doesn't necessarily require you to list those file formats or the preferred formats. But end users of your repository might be interested in that information. So that's informative information about the repository. That's not necessarily in scope for certification.
Nothing online, so.
Okay. Great. Well, we really appreciate everyone's active participation. Thank you so much for making time for this and your contributions, and we look forward to welcoming any new members into our working group. So thank you.
Thanks very much.